A passenger list would be prepared for people who did not exist. A civilian aircraft would leave Florida, disappear from radar, and appear to die over the Caribbean. A United States ship would burn in Cuban waters. Bombs would explode in American cities. Every surviving clue would point toward the same enemy, an enemy that had done none of it. The document carrying these ideas moved through the Pentagon under the highest classification. It was not a novel. It was not an enemy forgery. It was a proposed route to war. Its code name was Northwoods. On March 13, 1962, General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sent a memorandum to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Its title sounded bureaucratic: Justification for United States Military Intervention in Cuba. Its purpose was much clearer. The Joint Chiefs had been asked for what the document called brief but precise descriptions of pretexts that could justify American military action. Northwoods was never carried out. That fact matters. But so does another fact. These were not rumors invented decades later. The signed memorandum survives in the United States National Archives. And inside it, military planners did not merely ask how to respond to a Cuban attack. They explored how the appearance of one could be manufactured. To understand how this reached paper, we have to return to the year before. In April 1961, a force of Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, expecting to ignite an uprising against Fidel Castro. The invasion had been organized and supported by the CIA. It collapsed in days. More than 100 members of the invading force were killed, and more than 1,000 were captured. For Washington, it was a public humiliation. For Castro, it was proof that the United States intended to remove him. The Kennedy administration did not abandon that objective. Later in 1961, it authorized a new covert campaign known as Operation Mongoose. Economic pressure, propaganda, sabotage, and support for resistance inside Cuba were supposed to weaken the Castro government. Air Force Brigadier General Edward Lansdale became the operational coordinator. But Mongoose contained a problem. Covert pressure might destabilize Cuba, yet an open American invasion still required a political justification, something that could persuade Congress, allies, and the public that Cuba had become the aggressor. On March 5, 1962, Lansdale's office asked the Joint Chiefs for possible pretexts. 8 days later, Lemnitzer delivered Northwoods. The memorandum explained the desired result with unusual honesty. A series of incidents would place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances from what it called a rash and irresponsible Cuban government. The events should appear connected, but not so obviously connected that they expose the final objective. The first group of proposals centered on the American naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Friendly Cubans wearing Cuban uniforms could approach the base. Other friendly operatives could be captured as saboteurs. Riots could be started at the gates. Ammunition could be destroyed. Aircraft could be burned. Mortar shells could be fired from outside the perimeter. A ship in the harbor could be sabotaged. Then came a proposal designed to echo an older war. In 1898, the explosion of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor helped drive the United States toward war with Spain. Northwoods suggested arranging a new Remember the Maine incident. A United States ship could be blown up in Guantanamo Bay and Cuba blamed. One version tried to remove real sailors from the equation. An unmanned vessel could be destroyed near Havana or Santiago. Aircraft and ships would arrive for a rescue, but there would be no crew to rescue. Newspapers could print casualty lists filled with invented names, producing what the memorandum called a helpful wave of national indignation. That wording reveals the center of the plan. The target was not only military infrastructure, it was public perception. Fire, wreckage, and funerals were tools for creating consent. Another section moved the operation into Florida and Washington. The document proposed developing what it called a communist Cuban terror campaign. A boat carrying Cuban refugees toward Florida could be sunk, real or simulated. Attempts on the lives of refugees could be staged, including wounds dramatic enough to attract publicity. Plastic bombs could explode in carefully selected locations. Cuban agents could then be arrested beside prepared documents supposedly proving Havana's involvement. The memorandum did not specify one single approved attack. It assembled possibilities for later selection. Some were explicitly simulated. Others described real damage or real injuries. Treating every line as an order to murder Americans would overstate the evidence. Treating the document as harmless brainstorming would ignore what its authors wanted those incidents to accomplish. Then the planners described their most technically elaborate deception, a civilian airliner that would die without passengers. First, an aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact copy of a civilian plane owned by a CIA-connected company near Miami. The real aircraft would carry a selected group, possibly college students, traveling under carefully prepared aliases. A second aircraft, converted to remote control, would take its identity. South of Florida, the passenger aircraft would descend below normal observation and secretly land at an auxiliary airfield. The passengers would be removed. Meanwhile, the unmanned duplicate would continue along the filed route toward Cuba. Over the Caribbean, the drone would broadcast a distress call. Its transmission would claim that Cuban MiG fighters were attacking. Then a radio signal would destroy it in flight. Foreign radio stations would hear the distress call and the sudden silence. The story would reach the world through apparently independent witnesses, not through an American press release. To anyone following the flight, a civilian aircraft full of students had just been shot out of the sky, but the supposed dead would be alive at a hidden airfield. Their names were aliases. The wrecked aircraft was a duplicate. The only authentic element would be the outrage. Northwoods offered a similar concept involving an American military aircraft. One pilot would report that Cuban fighters had attacked him, then disappear at low altitude and land at a secure base. A submarine would scatter aircraft parts and a parachute in international waters. The other pilots would return believing their colleague had genuinely been lost. Search teams would find wreckage exactly where the radio call said it should be. This compartmentalization is important. Even participants inside the operation could be given only enough information to make their testimony sincere. A manufactured event becomes more convincing when most of the witnesses do not know it was manufactured. Why would senior officers believe ideas this extreme could become policy? The Cold War rewarded worst-case thinking. Cuba sat roughly 90 miles from Florida and was aligning with the Soviet Union. The Bay of Pigs had failed. American officials feared that waiting would allow Castro to grow stronger, while another covert failure would make direct intervention politically impossible. Northwoods transformed that frustration into a communications problem. If the public would not support an invasion without Cuban aggression, create evidence of Cuban aggression. The Joint Chiefs recommended that the memorandum be forwarded as a preliminary planning submission. They also recommended that responsibility for both overt and covert military aspects be assigned to the Joint Chiefs themselves. Lemnitzer's signature placed the proposal before McNamara on March 13th. What happened next is less cinematic and more important than many online retellings suggest. There is no evidence that any Northwoods incident was executed. It is also unclear whether President Kennedy personally studied every proposal in the 15-page package. But 3 days after Lemnitzer sent it to McNamara, a White House meeting addressed military intervention in Cuba. Lansdale's memorandum records Kennedy saying bluntly that they were not discussing the use of military force. The broader operation against Castro continued. Washington did not suddenly become peaceful toward Cuba, and Operation Mongoose still pursued sabotage and regime change. But Northwoods did not become an operational campaign. Lemnitzer's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs ended later that year. He was subsequently appointed Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. That sequence is sometimes presented online as proof of a darker plot surrounding Kennedy. The surviving Northwoods record does not prove such a connection, and this investigation will not invent one. For decades, the memorandum remained outside public view. Then the assassination of President Kennedy produced an unexpected route to disclosure. The 1992 JFK Records Act created a process that opened millions of pages held by federal agencies. Northwoods emerged through that review in the 1990s. The National Security Archive later placed the memorandum online in 2001. The conspiracy was finally visible, but not the conspiracy many people describe. There was no secret Northwoods attack that investigators proved had occurred. There was a documented proposal to manufacture the appearance of attacks, assign the blame to Cuba, and use the resulting anger to justify intervention. It reached the Secretary of Defense under the signature of America's highest-ranking military officer. Then it stopped before execution. That distinction is not a weakness in the story. It is the reason the story matters. Northwoods shows how easily a government's internal language can separate an event from its human meaning. A burning ship becomes a pretext. A missing aircraft becomes a communications mechanism. Invented casualties become a wave of indignation. The planners did not need every citizen to believe a complicated theory. They needed the public to see one unforgettable image and demand a response. The document also offers a test for every alleged conspiracy. What survives on paper? Who signed it? What stage did it reach? And what evidence shows it was actually executed? Northwoods passes the first 3 questions. It fails the 4th, and we should say so clearly. The most disturbing conclusion is therefore smaller than the wildest version, but far better documented. In 1962, senior American military planners formally proposed constructing false evidence of Cuban aggression as a path toward war. The plan was not carried out. The paper survived, and sometimes the paper is the crime scene.